Every garden has weeds, and you're advantaged if you know the structure of the weed and what the root system will be, because then you'll know whether or not you can pull it or you have to dig it out. And so I'm going to show you some different kinds. I didn't have over here a dandelion root. However, I brought one in from a different place in the garden. You can't pull that weed, and if you break it off, it'll just come back up again. Possibly 2 or 3 weeds will come back up again. And if you can't see that, well, I'm sorry. It's very impossible to pull. The buttonweed right here, which if you can see the structure of it, big round group of leaves, it usually will have a deep taproot. Sometimes the taproot will even be forked. But it's the kind of a thing which, if you're going to get it, you almost have to get underneath it and lift it up. Well, that taproot is not so big on that one, but you couldn't have pulled it anyway. It would just break off, and it'll come back up again. In contrast, the foxtail millet will have a diffuse root system, and ordinarily you can just pull it. It won't. It doesn't hold the ground very good at all. Same thing is true. This is a red root pigweed, and red root pigweed normally has a short, bulky taproot. The stem is strong, and you should be able to just pull that plant up. This plant, there's 2 plants right here. The leafy one is a milkweed type plant, and it's hollow stemmed and long rooted usually. And if you don't, you can't pull it up because it'll just break off. And when it breaks off, it comes back up again. That one hadn't grown very much. They'd be 3 times that long when they're grown up. I don't see any of them. I've dug them all out earlier. But anyway, that's the kind of thing. This plant is a sweet clover. It will grow tall if you leave it. It is a legume in the sense that it hosts back nodules on the roots that bring nitrogen out of the air into the soil. And usually the root is very deep. But this one's just a baby, only that deep, but it would continue to go down. I don't see any of the nodules on that, but that's what it does anyway. There are other weeds here. I kept these just for this purpose. This is a common weed. It's a lamb's quarter, and lamb's quarter is usually pretty easy to pull. Single taproot, not very deep, usually. Now these are a couple more button weeds, which I left because if I dug them out, I wouldn't have that one. But buttonweed, again, they usually have long and sometimes divided root taproots, and it's almost impossible just to pull them up when they get of any size. You see catnip growing. I leave it deliberately because it favors insects that pollinate. And it will blossom clear up until it freezes in the fall, and therefore they have food in the fall. I'll talk about pollinators a little bit more. This garbage can has sand in it. If you have clay that has too much soil, add a little sand, and this is fine sand. It also is useful if you want to dilute the seeds. Let's say you got a bunch of small carrot seeds and you want to spread them out a little bit and not have them planted so thickly. if you plant them with sand in your package or in your hand or whatever, it will tend to divide them up a little bit. So on. This plant shrub is a hazelnut, and hazelnuts are wild, native to this area. It is the kind of thing where I always think I'm going to transplant it, and I usually don't. That's not the way it works. If you want something like this planted, you plant it right where you want it, because if you don't, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it moved. It would now take a backhoe to move that thing, I think. So on. There are some weeds that you should not leave in the garden after you pull them up. Don't put them in your compost heap, don't do anything. Here's one of them. And the reason you don't is that every leaf on that plant will produce a new weed. And there's lots of them around here. I just happen to have these two here. And here's what I do with them. I put them in a jar, and then that jar goes to the landfill. I'm reusing a jar. And the second thing at this point is that if you're going to garden, you need to know what plants look like when they come up. And right here, and I don't know that I can actually show you, but there is dill coming up. I've got a better one over here, a little further away, I think. But anyway, if you don't know what it looks like, you're liable to pull that up. And while you're gardening, you need to know what every plant is when it first comes up and how it looks as it grows and what happens when it matures. You need to just get accustomed to memorizing that. And when I get through, I'm going to end on another weed you should never leave in your garden, right over there. This strawberry variety is one I can't seem to buy anymore. It's called Hecker. It's an ever-bearing strawberry. There are strawberries ripe on it right now. And in order to continue it, I have to capture the runners that come off of that strawberry patch. And the way you do that is pretty simple. And I will do one off on that corner, just set it up. But these are already done. When these plants came from those plants, then these plants came from these plants. And those are runners, and they would just keep sending out runners all year. I will then take the new plants, and in that bin right over there, I will plant them, because that was strawberries a year ago, but this year I put it into potatoes as an intermediate crop. Then I will take all that out. I have wire, hardware cloth on the bottom of that. I'll show you hardware cloth in a moment to discourage the gophers. I don't like to share with gophers. And I share a lot, but not with gophers. So this particular setup here with all these pots around the edges are all an attempt to capture plants. And I want you to notice how healthy the plants look on the edge there. Those are the ones in the pots. They are all potted in the same kind of material. It is recycled soil. Recycled soil in that barrel. Every time I have a potted plant that's no longer useful, I dump it out into this bin and mix it all in. And if it's like this one, it's got a lot of roots on it, I might actually throw it in a compost trench. But you see, when I get through, I have soil that I can put in a new pot. Then I'll put on top of that a layer of potting soil. And by the way, I recommend that you never handle potting soil with your bare hands. It dries out your skin, and I don't do it. I always wear rubber gloves. And if you were interested in, here's the next stage of dill. The ones that were over there had not yet put up any of these fronds. But that's what dill looks like when it gets just a little bit older. I'll kind of skip this section in here. These are hen and chicks, but at the very end I'll show you where I set up a hen and chicks bed over there, because at one time, I have all these because at one time there was a person working here who used to sell them. And the point being, you think, well, they're sitting in the shade, and that's the point. You don't set these out in the sun, in the full sun all day. If you do, they will not do as well as if you have them where they're in shade half the day or more. So the ones right next to those little walls are the better looking plants. And the ones more out in the sun, they look more like they're under stress. Strawberry plants are only productive for about 3 or 4 years. They need to be renewed. You can take them out individually, the old plants, if you keep track of them, but that's not what I do. I take out the entire bin, soil and all, and start over. And I do it about every 4 years. So next year I'll plant that one and take out the one clear over on the edge, the very first one. And that'll be the next one, and the next one's there. And I may take this, a different variety of strawberries, and I may take it out too. But that's pretty much the point of everything that's here. I recycle soil, put the hen and chicks in the shade, rotate crops, and take the strawberry plants, the runners off of the old strawberry plants to use in the new ones. I just was commenting that I let dill grow where it doesn't hurt me too much. It reseeds itself, or you can seed it. And if somebody wants seed, now's the time to collect seed. I've collected some seed. If you want some, I'll give it to you. You don't have to do anything with it. It's all over this ground. It will come up in a mat almost. And when I said I was going to do an example, a show and tell of how I do those plants back there, I have one pot right here that is now in a position to accept runners from this pot of runners. So what I'm doing here is simply putting the plants in place and locking them down with a piece of reused, bent, insulated copper wire. And if I want to do it, I can put another pot out here, and they'll just keep sending out shoots, runners, and I'll have 50 or 100 of them before the year is over. And that's all I'm going to do with strawberries. I do want to talk about this catmint a little bit, because it is so important. If you could photograph them, you could see bees on here right now. Not many of them, because we got them all stirred up, I guess. But there's bees and butterflies, pollinators. I leave a lot of plants for pollinators. And this was one of them, catmint, catnip. And one of the questions I got, and here's a show and tell, was how I start plants. And you'll have to photograph it probably from this side, but the way I start plants is tomato plants, for example, or pepper plants, is in a styrofoam cube with soil plugs in it, which you buy. And I think we get them all from Park Seed Company. And on that plug, in that plug, after it's all wet, it's been soaked, you put one tomato seed right in the top. There's a little slot in it, right in the top. Put one tomato seed. Set that on in a tray on a heated mat like this under lights. And that heated mat is on a piece of plywood, which allows me to lift it up if I want, higher and higher if I want. I've made dozens and dozens of these out of an old piece of paneling and chunks of cedar. They don't weigh anything, but you put it underneath the piece of plywood to keep the plants within 2 inches of the lights. These would have 4-foot shop lights on top up here, 1, 2, 3 banks. So you have 4 foot of shop light and trays of the styrofoam blocks with seeds, and it's the lights are on a timer. Give them 15 hours of light, but you never let a plant get more than 2 inches away from the light. Because if you do, it will start getting leggy, chasing light. It'll head up and they become skinny. And so I don't want to plant a skinny tomato plant. I want to plant a tomato plant that has a stalk at least as big as my finger and ready to go. So when it comes to starting tomatoes, and I guess I might as well just do that we might start, let's just say 100 plants. And there are people who are customers every year to come and get them. And I usually plant 30. This year, there was such a demand for plants, I only planted 19 because that's all I had left. But anyway, they are when they first come up, they're just little tiny things, and they, with a single stem, leaf kind of sticking out from it. But they don't have any true leaves at that point. And every day they are given a teaspoonful of water on each plant, but the water is just slightly fertilized, about a tablespoonful of fertilizer in a gallon of water. It isn't much. And then you keep jacking it up, and when the plants grow, let it down until they get up to where they are having true leaves come out the sides. Then they are transplanted into 4-inch pots. They go under another set of lights, different place. I'm set up for it to have as many as 100 plants or more on these, just set up just like this one. A piece of plywood on some board that I can keep piling up or taking down as I want. And if I can't do that, if I can't get high enough, I can go on top of this to raise the lights up. And the lights can get up here. So when I get through with them, they finally need to be put into gallon pots. They're all repotted. I take them to the greenhouse and carry them outside every day in order to get them used to wind and sunlight. So and if it's over 50 degrees, actually when they're in 4-inch pots, if it's over 50 degrees, I'll carry them outside and set them in a pen outside to keep the deer from eating them off. That's and then carry them back in at night. You don't want the temperature on the plant to get under 50. If it stays over 50 at night, you can leave them outside. But if it's not going to stay over 50, you don't want them outside. You want them inside. You don't want to set them back. So anyway, they're all repotted into gallon pots, and then I carry them outside every day and inside every night. They're still under lights, but not on heated mats in the greenhouse. The heated mats are done when they are moved into gallon pots. And this process usually begins about the third week in March. And by May, I'd like to start planting them out in the garden. I usually take a chance and put out 1 or 2 in the first week, but this year wasn't good for that at all. It was second week before I ever got anything in the garden. And then the temperatures at night were not high enough to have the tomatoes set on tomatoes. They need temperatures of about 50 degrees at night to set tomatoes. And we didn't get it. It was a lousy spring. But anyway, that's the way we start. Tomatoes, peppers, tall zinnias, but not in styrofoam plugs. Tall zinnias just set in 6-packs, and when they grow up and they're not repotted ordinarily, they're put out into the garden. They're started last, and they're planted out usually in the late May, after the likelihood of frost is gone. They're very sensitive to frost. So well, anyway, enough for this. I'm going to do one other thing, 2 other things while I'm here. This item is for racking up raspberries. It involves no tying. You'll see them as we go by them right down here. No staking, no tying. All you have to have is this rack on a steel post. Steel posts play a big role in my gardening, which means you got to have a steel post driver. But the reason I do this, and I'll turn it this way, is because you need to take the canes out, the old canes, 1 year old, out of the raspberries every year. Whatever produced berries this year is history. The only ones that will produce berries next year are the ones that are canes this year. Well, the last day of 1997, I retired from teaching after 41 years, and it was great. I never tired of that. But I did now have time to figure out how to solve some of the problems that had plagued me for 65 years. And one of them was raspberries, where you had to either tie them to wires or to stakes or whatever. So if you have a steel post that fits right here, and you only have to lift it up this high, get it across the steel post, put it down, because there's a notch down below. The design is such that you can then put your top rail here and your side rail, bottom rail, here. And I just use poles, as you can see, and we'll get there, to do that. But you take the poles away when you're taking the canes out in the fall. Use the poles to rack them back up, lay them up here, and the top one up here, and it's done. It's really quite simple, especially if you have a whole bunch of poles, as I do. This is a different setup. That one is designed for tomatoes. I always hated wire cages for tomatoes. And after I retired, I designed a new system, and this is it. It has changed over the years. So this is not exactly like the ones I first built, but the idea was that I would not have to worry about them sprawling all over the place and the tomatoes being on the ground. So I left a fairly large hole up here in the top. These are 6 feet tall for an ordinary indeterminate tomato plant. Now some tomato plants are determinate. They only grow short like this, but the indeterminate ones will go high. As I learned more, I now make the top wider, and even wider than this one, and I put the rails at alternate places. This does not match this, because the way you use this is simple. Just take a piece of stick, you'll see it down the tomatoes, and lay it across the rails. It'll hold your plant in the wind, unless you got really high winds, in which case you better stake this down, because as this gets full of tomato, it will catch a lot of air and tip it over. I know people that's happened on. However, it works better than I ever imagined it would. These are all made out of scrap wood. There's nothing in these that are like new boards that I bought, although for one lady, I did build her out of new cedar for various reasons. But ordinarily, I just use scrap stuff. They are put together with a brad nailer, air compressed brad nailer, and then screwed in the sides with screws through this way. There are 2 screws there, there's 8 screws total holding it up, holding it together. It's pretty sturdy and pretty strong. They do rot away eventually at the bottoms. They will break. If they come apart here, where the brad nails are, I repair them with a screw. Drill first, otherwise you'll split this little board. Drill first and put a screw in it, and the screw must have a finish washer. A finish washer has a cup to hold your screw from going on into the wood. It stops it. So I don't have any finish washers on this one, but I do have on some where I have repaired them. But anyway, that's what this is, and I call it a frame for tomatoes. The wire cage is obsolete for anything like this. If anybody has ever used wire cages, they surely must know what I'm talking about. I did one other thing, and it's with beans, and we'll do that when we get down to beans. Okay, let me shift over to tools. Okay, I want to talk about some tools, and if you're going to garden from my perspective, I use what I call a poacher's shovel. It's a very narrow shovel. You can dig deeply with it, and still, like you want to make a hole for a tomato plant to plant it, you can do it just like that. And I also like the spading fork, which is a very sturdy fork that I can get down deeply under the weeds. I have more than one of these. This is for weeding by hand. I have these 2, but I always go for this one when I have a choice. It's more slender, more narrow, and not curved the way that one is. I have 2 for close-up weeding or hoeing, hilling up around corn, for example. I like this one better than this one, but this one has some purposes, especially if you're wanting to drag dirt. I like and use what's called a scuffle hoe or stirrup hoe. It's much faster for hoeing than a regular hoe. You need a regular hoe, but the scuffle hoe is more swift. A regular hoe like this is better if you're making rows, or if you are tamping down your rows after you've planted the seed. Shovels need both flat-faced and pointed shovels, and you got to have a rake or 2 or 3 in order to level ground, get the rocks out, whatever it is, so on. I do mention several times that I use hardware cloth around plants and under the beds to discourage gophers. This is hardware cloth, 2 types of it. I prefer the heavier duty stuff, and I cut it with a set of tin snips. The make is Wiss on these. I have small tools like this, but rarely use it. You'll see around here splitters. All of this is irrigated by water or with hoses. The splitter allows you to hook up a hose going in two directions, turn on one of them or both of them if you want, and shut it off so you don't have to go wandering out to your sprinkler. This is my answer to watering from up high. The hose hooks on here. This fits in here. This particular one came off of that post right there. Stands up, it's screwed in because that post is drilled. A lot of them are just tied on to the posts. You need trowels. This is a very handy trowel if you're scooping up soil, putting it into a pot. If you're going to do real tight work, something narrower is probably better. I use knee pads a lot because they save a lot on my knees. This is the measuring sticks for determining how wide your rows will be. You have a post, and I'd set one up here just to show you. A post in the ground, and let's just say you want the row to be 18 inches away. Well, in this case, you would drive another post at 18 inches. This one is at the same time you're using both of these, 18 inches, and you put a rope. In my case, I have it hooked to sash weights, recycled. You know what a sash weight is? It used to help you lift your windows in the old houses because it was down inside the wall. Well, I use it for holding my line in place, that I can then draw a line along it to make a straight line for a row of vegetables. And by having these on both ends, I can get them even every time. I probably should take a little bit of time because I've got to answer a couple of questions. I want to answer a couple of questions. I try to be helpful. I hoard no secrets. If anything I know on a success or a failure, I'm happy to share. I resist all my urges to tell people what they should do because I don't know. Every spot is different. Every gardening spot is different, and you have to sort of do it in order to get to know. But I offer advice. I tell you what I do, and if it works for you, great, you're welcome. I want you to be better at this game than I am. As Aldous Huxley put it, no greater honor can come to a teacher than to have his students exceed him. So there you go. I want you students to exceed anything I've ever done. The one question that came to me was on starting plants. I've covered it. I want to introduce why I think this is a good spot for gardening by pointing out that everything is connected to everything else. And this will be in the narrative more than I'm going to say. But this area at one time was flat. There was no ridge, and it wasn't very long ago either, probably no more than 17, 18 million years ago. About 17 million years, 14 million years, lava poured out all over this area in multiple flows, and in between you had soil forming, forests growing, rhinoceros grazing, and it was a totally different looking area. No ridge. Think of the area as being flat. Lava was liquid, it was pretty flat. And between those times, and subsequently, there's a lot of dust moves through this country right now, and there was a lot of dust then. And when you have several million years of dust, you get some dust dunes. Today, the best known dust dunes in the whole world probably are the Palouse Hills of Washington State. This here once had dust dunes on it. And then very recently, only 6 million years ago, the Cascades began to uplift here. And in the process, they bent that basalt. The same rock that is up on Lion Rock is several thousand feet underneath the Kittitas Valley in Ellensburg, and is the same rock that's up here. So you have a series of anticlines and synclines, or uplifts and down thrusts all along. The Cascades are still growing. Now you think, well, we don't notice it very much, but just think of this. In order to get to the general height of the Cascades, which is around 6,000 feet out here, it only needs a net uplift of 1 inch a century. And in a lifetime, you wouldn't notice because you don't live that long. Much of that downward uplift, as soon as it began to uplift, all that dust was unstable. And as a result of rain, glaciers never got to here. The glaciers only got to Tainham Creek out here just beyond Thorpe. But there was a lot of wash come off that hill. Physics will require, when you slow down the water, as it would slow down out here at the base of that ridge, the big rocks drop. On down there, right in here where my trees are, the little rocks drop. Out here, the dust drops. So I don't have many rocks in this land at all. And in the Kittitas Valley, that's kind of unique. Now, the Monastash Creek at one time flowed right there where my fence is on the back, washed away most of that soil. It's an alluvial fan. The Monastash moves back and forth across its alluvial fan, dumping material coming out of the mountains. And it would continue to do that, but we don't like that. We think the creek is where it should be in its channel right now, which is going to cost a lot of money over time because it will keep filling up and you have to keep digging it out. You should let it move. If you let it move, it would go to a lower spot and probably not flood anybody for another 400 years. Anyway, this spot is a tiny remnant of that washed down soil off the mountains. And that's I'm not going to talk about the climate. We know it's a steppe, pretty arid. But if you look up on the hills up here, you'll see there are trees off this direction, shrub steppe off this direction. It's called an ecotone in biology, where you're changing from one type of vegetation to another. And I think it's more interesting to know what you're looking at. But winds increase evaporation as well. In the wintertime, there's almost no sunlight coming down on this north-facing slope. Winds, however, this is the least windy corner of the valley. I did wind studies, and I always tell people, you don't believe me? Look at the trees. We planted all those trees, they grow straight. If you live on the north side of the valley, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The trees there are cut by wind shear. My personal background, how I happened to get into the gardening business, I guess. I do want everyone to know that I have no formal preparation whatsoever and no credentials in gardening as such. I'm not a botanist, I'm not a zoologist, I'm not a soil scientist, I'm not a master gardener, I'm not an organic gardener. I just sort of do what I think works. And if production is a valid measure, then I call myself a successful, reasonably successful garden. And it started very young. I don't know who asked the question about what it was like when I was young in gardening, but I'll bet they didn't know that my wife and I had finished a book a few years ago on our young lives for our children and grandchildren, because we were both born in 1934, and we were both into the Great Depression. And so I could spend 2 or 3 hours just reading from the book if you want. As it is, I brought only one photo right there. And that photo was the year I was in first grade. And I want you, if you don't understand the times, I want you to recognize that most of us had 2 sets of clothes. We had good clothes and we had work clothes. Those are the good clothes. There was no money for new clothes. And I had a continuous tutorial on how to be useful in a farm. a subsistence farm where we grew everything, gardens, horses, cattle, pigs. We butchered our own meat. We ate it. Chickens, lots of chickens. What we did have was labor. That's us. And we worked hard at it. The World War II came along. It was no better, maybe worse. All the young men left, and children were left to pick up a lot of the slack. So by the time I was 9, I had my first paying job. 10 hours a day, driving a horse, putting loose hay in the barn, and I worked at that farm for 12 days. At the end, I was paid $6 for 12 days, 50 cents a day. But people ask me, how come I work so cheaply? I said, look, it was not an option of working for 50 cents a day or $1 a day. It was an option of working for 50 cents a day or nothing. The work had to be done. We understood that, and the work was going to get done. We had hundreds of jars of food in our cellar. We were never hungry, and I think the food was better. I keep growing it. Frequently I'm asked, how old are you? And I am 86 years old, and I can say I've traveled a lot of roads, and a lot of them weren't paved. I missed, and barely missed, by seconds and minutes, many good opportunities to die young. And it's in the book, by the way. But I was born in 34 in a town, in a house that no longer exists, in a town that no longer exists. Grew up in a farmhouse on the west side of a mountain overlooking the Columbia River. House no longer exists. I began grade 1 in one-room, 8th grade school, and there it is. That no longer exists. For grades 6 through 12, I had a daily bus ride 33 miles each way to a school which no longer exists. I never expected to go to college. We didn't have any money. But a high school teacher herded me in that direction. It's a long story, and I won't tell you. And I did go to college, as it turned out. Graduated in 1951. Over the next 18 years, I earned 2 BA degrees at Eastern Washington, a Master of Science degree at Oregon State, and a PhD at the University of Michigan. Good thing I had a very supportive family, my wife. Otherwise, you just couldn't do that. The vast majority of my teaching was here at the CW in Ellensburg. I think there is no time, not much time left for us to change how we relate to the planet. I'm serious about that. And most people don't understand either how the atmosphere is warmed or how plants function or much of anything else. I get a lot of comments from gardeners and from hikers, I mean, about the garden. And a lot of them are, geez, that looks like a lot of work. But I advise them to start small. Failure on this scale would be devastating. Do something that you can do. One guy stood out there and he said, "Don't you ever let my wife see this garden. She'll want one just like it." I say, so? What, is that a problem? Why? Let's just do it, huh? Well, anyway, I get a question sometimes that's really meant to be sarcastic. It goes like this: what do you do in your spare time? As though I didn't have any, you know. And my answer is straightforward. I do research, I read, I ponder the human future on Earth, I occasionally edit a book or edit a report or a book manuscript, I analyze and write on natural resource issues, problems, environmental impact statements, and I prepare and deliver public lectures. In addition, I build wooden door handles out of mostly curved hawthorn, and there's one on that shed right over there. I also build wooden boxes, I was much happier that I could design the jig to build them on, but they are pretty neat if you want to paint them. They were designed to hold CDs. I also build game boards from scrap wood, and otherwise might go to waste. There won't be time to show you one later, but I brought examples. That is a four-handed cribbage board, cross crib. And it's made out of old boards, old places. I tired of just having a single strip color, so I then started cutting every block separately out of a knot. And I've built a number of these. The backside has a chessboard and checkerboard, and there's no use letting something that beautiful go to waste or burn it when it can be done, when it can be used as they can. At least I can. Another one. Your objectives for your garden should be clear. You will probably not garden out of necessity to assure survival, and you should not garden with the expectation of saving a lot of money. I prefer to have my fresh food. I do not use any pesticides. I'd rather not have, I think residual pesticides are a problem on what we eat. And I just prefer to eat food. Well, I haven't talked about soil very much, but I did a little bit. I continually add material to this soil, organic material, because the biota in the soil have to be fed. If they are not fed, then they won't do the work of breaking down all that stuff and releasing the nutrients into the soil, which is what they do. The wooden walkways I build, I move around. The permanent walkways are simply bark mulch. At one time I was putting this kind of stuff, weed block, underneath it. I quit because when it wears out, it doesn't block weeds all that swell anyway. And when it wears out, then it's a real pain to take up and throw away. I do put it under my walkways that I take up every year, and I move the walkways around because under the walkways the biota work freely all summer long and make nice soil. When all the old canes are taken out, you cut the top off the new cane, because then it will send out side shoots, and you will have a lot more raspberries at eye level than you will have if you just let them grow up. These things will grow sometimes 10 feet tall if you let them. I don't. Now, that one will grow side shoots. If it doesn't do it this fall, it'll do it in the spring. And I'll do that with all of them. This one I did some time ago just for you, so you can see what happens. In the spring, early, I have a frame that I set on top of it, an old cover for a skylight. I can warm up the soil then, because squash seeds do not like cold soil. So you warm up the soil and put about 8 seeds in that thing. If 7 of them come up, you leave 3 and move the other 4 out that way. This year nothing came up to begin with. It was too cold. So I planted more seeds. Then they all came up. I now have enough zucchini for the county. We start the tall zinnias in the house and transplant them when they are about that tall, however. And they are here for, first they're beautiful, but notice all the insects and butterflies and stuff around them. These are food for butterflies. As soon as it freezes, they're gone. But right now, they're popular. The corn did not sprout well this year. This is a second planting and it's better, and we're not getting any corn off of it yet. So We're getting corn, however, from my son and my son-in-law, who both had better luck on their gardens. I leave cosmos, those flowers, wherever they come up in a corner like that. They are good food for insects. If you want to have pollinators, there are 3 things you've got to do. First, you cannot spray pesticides, because if you do, it kills everything. You must leave on the ground things which will let them go underneath in the winter for a home. And third, you've got to give them some food in late summer and fall, when most natural plants are gone. By the way, there's a lesson right here if you want to take it. One place said, give me some tips on gardening. Well, when you roll up on the ground a hose, you never allow the loop you're now doing to lap over the one that was ahead of it. Because if you do, then they'll get wrapped up and being more difficult to do. This one I can take and walk away with it, and it will just go right out. You do the same thing with electric cords, or with hoses, or whatever, ropes, any of that. Just save yourself a lot of trouble. 2 things here. One is trench composting. If you have coarse material like corn stalks or gladiola stems or something like that, they don't break down very quickly in the soil. But if you will drop them into a soil like this, into a trench, and bury them, it's deeper than you're going to be tilling, deeper than you're going to be working, but the soil biota will break them down in a couple of years. They'll just be gone. And so I do that. I don't have trenches all over the place, but I did have one here for you, and I would put those corn stalks, that old pot made of fiber, maybe even some cardboard in it, but a whole lot of stuff, and without much soil on top, it will work. These tanks, well, that pile right there is needles for blueberries. The blueberry plants must have acidic conditions. I didn't do that the first time I planted blueberries, but I certainly did the next time. And what I did was take all the soil out, about 16 inches across and 12 inches deep, pile it up, mix in acidic material like peat moss or needles from trees, and added elemental sulfur, the very type you'd use for fertilizer in a field. And put it back in and planted the plants, and there they are. So I do not test the soil. I have no idea what it says. They prefer a pH 4.5 to 5. Most soil in the Kittitas Valley will be 7 to 7.5. Most of it's alkaline. The water here is ditch water because it is less alkaline than the water in my well. Therefore, when the water is shut off for irrigation, this water will be carried into the blueberries, so they will still have. Every spring when each plant blossoms, and there are 21 plants, I give each one 2 gallons of an acidifying fertilizer, Miracid, something like that. Same thing you'd put on a rhododendron or an azalea. It's an acid fertilizer. So they get that every year. The window in the cage is to encourage mason bees that live in those homes right there to go in. They don't like to fly up, over, and down. The top of this comes off. It's all wire, because if you don't, the birds will eat all your blueberries. So therefore, this is all caged in. The bottom has larger wire because if you don't, the bull snakes can't get through. And I once used netting, and that was a disaster because they could get their heads through, but they couldn't back out. And 2 of them at least died. So I quickly put in a larger mesh. Most birds are not going to go down there and go through that. So, well, okay, let's try another. Go around this way. The onion, the key to onions first is growing the right varieties. This first row has some Walla Walla Sweets in it. They are very nice onions that do not keep. The next row is copra, which you can't buy the seed for anymore because some company in Texas bought all the seed in America, and if you want copra onion, you just buy starts from them for about $18. And if the only way to avoid that is to buy a whole lot of them, and if someone like Master Gardeners got together, they can get a cheaper group. I also grow Red Bull. You can see those are red onions in the next row, and Patterson, which is billed as good as Copra Keeper. I have a Copra from last year laying over there on the table. Perfectly good, and they'll keep for 12 months easy. But here's what you got to do. This is the key to it. You have to take an onion like that after the top's fallen over, lay it out, let it dry, cut the top off, let the roots totally dry. There can be no white, no live root left, or they'll just rub right off. Then you can store it in a mesh sack in a cool place. I store them in my garage, and it works fine. That's it. These plants, I've already told you about the frame and how I hated those wire cages, so I invented this, and it works fine. All the places underneath hold you do have to go along and move the leaders in as they're growing. Otherwise, they have a tendency to just sprawl all over. But I don't let that happen. I move them in and keep them going. The short plants I put in 5 foot. The legs on this is 5 foot tall as supports. The taller plants are 6 foot. You have to know which are which. And each of these cages will have a name on it. B. Roma is a burpee Roma. Grape, super steak, that's a slicer tomato. I once grew one that weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces. It came on early in the year too. Okay, enough for tomatoes. The carrot bed should be deep. And the reason it should be deep, that is by you have it loose, a lot of organic material in it, maybe some sand in it, because otherwise your carrots will tend, as many of these are, tend to grow up out of the ground. And if you go to pull one, you can't pull it because it's got a hold of something down there. When I dig carrots, when I harvest them, I don't pull them. I go right along the side of the entire row and dig a ditch with my poacher's shovel, and take them out. Some of them will be this long or longer. I grow Yaya hybrid seeds, get at a territorial seed company. And we're very satisfied with them. They will keep a long time, but I wash them all, put them in those green vegetable bags. You know what I'm talking about? Green vegetable bags, and then put them in the refrigerator. I have kept carrots in coolers, food coolers, with just peat moss. They will survive, do well over the winter in just that. I don't think they do as well as if you've got them under refrigeration.